The overall aftermath was rough for the losing side. Shortly following the resolution of the conflict, Carthage had attempted to withhold funds from some of the foreigners they had enlisted in the war, which led to a fairly disastrous revolt. For the most part, the rebels were eventually put down, but in the meantime, Rome managed to seize Sardinia and Corsica from Carthage, which the latter wanted back. By 237 BC, they were ready to launch a campaign to actually go recover them, but Rome was not going to allow that. They immediately deemed this as an act of war, and with Carthage still recovering from the decades-long conflict they had just gotten out of, this quickly put a stop to their endeavor. Rome managed to strong-arm their foe into not only giving up Sardinia, but also Corsica, in addition to a 1,200 talent payment. Despite agreeing, Carthage was furious with their Roman bullies, and many within the empire became radicalized. One of these men was Hamilcar Barca. Hamilcar was a famed and seasoned military leader on the side of Carthage. His forgiveness would never come, and until his last breath, it would be his biggest dream to get revenge for Carthage's loss in the First Punic War. But this would not be possible on such short notice, as Carthage still needed to refuel and revive itself from the first conflict, followed by the rebellion. So for now, Hamilcar looked to the Iberian Peninsula, not Italy. Carthage had already found success with their Phoenician colonies in Spain and the mass amounts of resources in the form of silver. So it seems the most logical to have Hamilcar go there to expand Carthaginian influence and claim. Upon doing so, he initially established himself in Cadiz and branched out from there. Over time, Hamilcar's army grew as he did his control of the region on behalf of Carthage. But in 229 BC, the great general drowned before ever having a chance to leave Iberia and seek the revenge he so badly wanted. Nonetheless, Hamilcar Barca had a son by the name of Hannibal, and he had raised his young boy with a burning passion and hatred for Rome, just as he himself maintained. This ensured that even after Hamilcar's death, Carthage would remain staunch enemies of the Roman Republic. In the wake of Hamilcar's absence, a man by the name of Hasdrubal the Fair would take over leadership in Carthage's Iberian possessions, which by now covered roughly half of the peninsula with an ever-growing army. By 226 BC, Rome was becoming somewhat anxious about the success that their foe was having over in Iberia. And so a treaty was signed on the agreement of Hasdrubal, which stated that Carthage would not expand into the south past River Ebro in Spain. And Hasdrubal meant what he said, but Hannibal, on the other hand, did not intend to follow such an agreement. After all, his father had taught him too well for such a thing. Only a few years after negotiations between Rome and Carthage, Hannibal took control of Spain after Hasdrubal was killed and almost immediately began to push beyond the current borders. The final straw for Rome would be when Hannibal captured Saguntum in 219 BC, stripping the Republic of one of their longtime allies in the region. Rome was deeply annoyed by this, and thinking that Hannibal couldn't be too hard to defeat, declared war by the spring of 218 BC. As Rome was gearing up for war with the new young gun of Carthage, Hannibal was cooking up his own plan, and he wasn't just an average general. He had learned quite a bit about Rome over the years, and he realized that the Republic had a good record of defeating opponents outside of Italy, but maybe not inside. If the Romans went after Hannibal in Spain, he might lose. But if he went after them in Italy, he might win. As a result, the young general left his brother in charge of their holdings with an army of his own, while Hannibal led the rest of their troops across the Alps in a matter of days. Although it would only take 15 days, Hannibal and his men faced more resistance than they had expected to as they marched towards Italy. The local Gallic tribes didn't take kindly to these intruders, and by the time the Carthaginians had finished their journey, over half of the troops had either been killed, injured or deserted. Luckily for Hannibal, though, some of the locals in Italy were deeply unsatisfied with Roman rule and began to join the Carthaginian cause. As this new coalition marched on, Hannibal found success in multiple early skirmishes, like the Battle of Ticinus, the Battle of the Trebia, and the Battle of Lake Trasimene. The Romans had been taken aback by the developing situation, given that they had expected to go and fight Hannibal in the Iberian Peninsula, not on their own turf. But here he was, and the threat could not be ignored. So far, the Carthaginian general had been proven right. The Romans were looking weak on their own soil, and Hannibal had even managed to build up his army thanks to the locals. His confidence was on the rise, and it would get an even bigger boost in the summer of 216 BC when both sides met at Cannae. Earlier that year, Hannibal had captured a crucial supply depot in the town, which was disastrous for the Romans, and furthermore concerns them that the invader would soon take control of the entire city. As a result, the Romans decided to resolve the situation via combat. The first clash between the Romans, under the command of Consul Varro, and the Carthaginians was only a minor skirmish after the latter had ambushed the Romans on the way to Cannae. As the battle eventually played out along the river Aufidus, Hannibal would yet again crush the hometown Roman troops, sustaining fairly minimal casualties himself. This victory triggered a wave of support, with city-states all throughout southern Italy pledging loyalty to the Carthaginian side. And although this was a great achievement, Hannibal still found himself in a new predicament. He had no reinforcements. If he was to continue and head straight for Rome itself, he'd have to do it without any backup, as his brother was held up back in Spain and no one could assist from Carthage. Rome, however, had adopted a new policy of essentially avoiding Hannibal entirely. They enacted the Fabian policy, which planned for the Romans to focus on defeating the allies and blocking resources of the Carthaginians to first cripple Hannibal's forces. And as the latter's advantage seemed to be slipping away, Rome refused to accept any negotiations for peace. While Hannibal scrambled to retain control over his captured Italian territories, the Romans would attack wherever he wasn't. The Carthaginian offensive was beginning to fall apart. They failed to take Sardinia back, their authority was constantly being challenged, and no one was being sent to assist. By 207 BC, all Hannibal had left was Bruttium. The Romans were now controlling the seas to cut off the Carthaginians from help or supply. And back in Spain, Hasdrubal had been beaten down and lost control, while a new wave of Carthage Italian allies were instead turning to Rome with their loyalty. Running on their building momentum, the Romans next moved to Africa to give Hannibal a taste of his own medicine. As Hannibal continued his struggle in Italy, the Romans, now under the command of Consul Scipio, invaded Africa in 204 BC and began to wreak havoc. Their Numidian allies joined them while the Carthaginians prepared to send troops back home under Gisco to fight off the problematic Romans. Upon arrival, they were joined by their own Numidian ally in the form of Prince Syphax and his troops. This coalition eventually clashed with the Roman invaders, and luck was not on Carthage's side. The Romans were victorious, and having now captured enough territory, including Tunis, to make Hannibal himself fear that the worst was yet to come for the city of Carthage, the Carthaginians were becoming desperate. Hannibal subsequently returned from Italy as negotiations occurred, but provided nothing between Rome and Carthage. His arrival in 202 BC would bring about the dramatic end to the Second Punic War. As autumn rolled around, Hannibal and Scipio were ready to come face to face, literally. The opposing generals met personally at a plain near Narragara. It's unknown exactly what was said, but if any attempts had been made at ending the war through diplomacy, they failed miserably. with 35,000 and 40,000 infantry and 6,000 and 4,000 cavalry respectively for Rome and Carthage, the armies were ready for the final spectacle. In addition to his men, Hannibal also had 80 war elephants, but these proved to be a detriment instead of an aid. The Romans managed to dodge the initial carnage of the animals before scaring them back towards the Carthaginians, creating a chaotic scramble that allowed the Roman forces to swoop in and decimate Hannibal's left wing despite their best efforts to fight back. The Roman left wing then attacked Carthaginians' right flank, while the centers of both, led by Scipio and Hannibal themselves, marched toward each other. As this clash raged on, the Roman cavalry were destroying their Carthaginian counterpart before charging at Hannibal's center from the rear, while the Roman center had them trapped from the front. This was it. This was the end of the Second Punic War, and just as those before him had done, Hannibal failed to defeat the mighty Romans. Though Hannibal would manage to escape, there was no more hope for Carthage to compete with their opponent. The Carthaginian government was forced to sue for peace and sign a treaty that would essentially bankrupt the once formidable adversary of the Romans. And now, Carthage was no longer allowed to declare war without the consent of Rome. They were also required to give up their naval fleet, altogether crushing any prospects of Carthage remaining a dominant military power as they had been. So, in spite of early wins and the leadership of the renowned Hannibal, Carthage lost, and it seemed that still, Rome was truly invincible.